Apple has completed its iPhone 16 family with its introduction of the iPhone 16e last week. It's calling this the most affordable member of the family, and yeah, at $599, I guess technically it is the lowest cost iPhone 16 available. But it is much more expensive than the iPhone SE series that used to be thought of as Apple's mid-range or lower cost option. So unfortunately for those of you who are waiting or holding out for the iPhone SE 4th generation before upgrading from yours, that may no longer be an option. However, if you are contemplating your first iPhone ever, or if you're switching, or if you're upgrading from just a very old model of iPhone, or if you're wondering what all that fuss is about for Apple Intelligence, the iPhone 16e might be worth considering. So for this review, I really am focusing on which of the iPhones that are available should you be considering. Because let's face it, if you're going to buy an Android, you're not going to be thinking about iPhone at all. In fact, if you're an iOS person at all, you're not going to be looking at any of the large number of sub $500 Android phones that are out there that have way better specs. Now, if you're considering a new iPhone, your options probably are just the iPhone 16, iPhone 16e, iPhone 16 Pro, or maybe an older iPhone 15 or a refurbished iPhone 14 or older. To be clear, Apple continues to sell the iPhone 15, so you could get that for just $100 more than the iPhone 16e, but that will not come with Apple Intelligence. So for this review, I'm going to really focus on telling you exactly what the differences are between the 16e and the iPhone 16. So at a high level, to me, the most functional difference between the two devices is the fact that the iPhone 16 has a dual camera system, and the iPhone 16e has what Apple is calling a two-in-one camera system. The fact that they're calling it a two-in-one system at all tells me that they know people want two cameras at this price, but they decided not to do it. Now, this is a single 48 megapixel camera sensor that Apple can crop in to create this sort of telephoto 2x zoom option within the camera app. Whereas the iPhone 16 has two cameras, a 48 megapixel main sensor as well as a 12 megapixel ultra wide. Its 48 megapixel is doing pretty much the same. You're going to crop in from that 48 megapixel resolution to get a 2x digital zoom. Apple calls it an optical zoom. It'll show up as one of the zoom options on the viewfinder. Basically, for all intents and purposes, the iPhone 16 will show 0.5, 1, and 2, whereas the iPhone 16e only shows 1 and 2x. In addition to that zoom difference, you'll also be lacking what Apple calls focus portraits. So in portrait mode, there was a time when Apple just used face detect to kind of tell that there's a subject in the picture you want in focus, and then it can apply a blur through software to the rest of the background. In the early stages of this feature, people noted that it wasn't very accurate at detecting outlines, or it would blur out parts of the picture that weren't meant to be blurred out. And really, I saw that in my testing with the iPhone 16e versus, say, the 16 or the 16 Pro. Without an ultra-wide, the iPhone 16e is also missing a macro mode that you'll get on the iPhone 16, and you're also missing things like spatial or cinematic videos. The two of them keep the same front cameras though, so you'll have Face ID, and there's a lot of other similarities across the 16e and 16 that I will get into later on. Just know though that there's no camera control on the 16e, while there is one on the iPhone 16. One more thing that the iPhone 16 does have that the iPhone 16e doesn't is the latest generation of photographic styles. This is a bummer for me because I actually really liked the photographic styles that debuted with the iPhone 16 launch last year. It just uses better depth information to apply filters and color effects onto your photos. So if you've been playing around with those and you like them, you might miss them, but I doubt that anyone considering a 16e right now has even looked at them. So in testing the iPhone 16e, which I keep calling the iPhone SE4, it's felt a bit like I've been traveling through time. Really, I've been forced back 2 years in switching from my iPhone 16 Pro to the iPhone 16e. And so to kind of align with that theme, I'm going to take y'all through a photographic renaissance tour of things at the Met Museum in New York. So by and large, I didn't see drastic differences between the 16E and the iPhone 16 in terms of color, clarity, and general quality of images. Where I did find myself struggling was every now and then I wanted to switch over to the ultra wide just to capture, say, the breadth of the reservoir at Central Park, for example, or a glass display of plates that British people collected as art, for example. I could not zoom out and get the entire height of the column with the iPhone 16E, whereas I could with the 16. But what I found more annoying is in portrait mode. I'm a portrait mode photographer, and I apologize, I guess, for that, but if you're like me and you like that sort of bokeh effect, Apple's option has always kind of struggled compared to what Google's Pixel and Samsung's phones can even do. Now, I will acknowledge that more recent iPhones have improved because Apple has added more depth information and what it's calling depth control and focus in its next-gen portraits. So they've worked a bit better, and they can work on things like a dish of food or your pet. But at the Met, where I was taking photos of busts and paintings and the religious figures in sculptures, for example, I could not always get that pleasant blurry effect in the background with the iPhone 16e. That makes sense, right? Not all of these have very clearly defined faces or facial features. But when it did notice a face and it did latch on and apply the blur, it didn't do so with the same accuracy as an iPhone 16 or even a 16 Pro or even a Pixel would. Now, to be clear, that's a problem very specific to people like me who abuse portrait mode probably, but if you're looking to shoot in low light, for example, you'll find the quality that the two phones deliver fairly similar, with one caveat being that I noticed when shooting the photos that night mode would take a little bit longer to capture the photo on the 16e than the iPhone 16. This is a good time to point out that both these phones use basically the same A18 chip. The only difference is that the 16e has a 4-core GPU as opposed to the 5-core one on the iPhone 16. Leaving the Renaissance behind and coming back to more modern times, there are a few other differences I'm going to kind of cover between the iPhone 16e and iPhone 16 that might influence your decision as to which one to get. Now, while both of them have the same 6.1-inch Super Retina OLED screen, there's one main difference, and it was jarring for me going from an iPhone 16 Pro to an iPhone 16e because the bezels were a lot thicker and the notch at the top is there instead of a dynamic island. Now, the dynamic island isn't just an aesthetic difference. This pill is also where your live activities API things sit. So for example, if you've got an Uber order or a DoorDash order running in the background, at least when it's sitting in the dynamic island, it is out of the way and minimizes when you don't really need it to take up less space. In the notch, it kind of stays up there and takes up space, and only certain apps will it go away and hide in the corner. Now, the other interesting thing about the iPhone 16e is that it features Apple's own C1 modem, which basically is the first time Apple's designed its own modem for a phone. It's supposed to not only, do the usual modem things like support 5G and support eSIMs, it also is supposed to improve power efficiency to the point it ekes out about 4 hours more battery life from the 16e compared to the iPhone 16. It's still too early days for me to know for sure, so make sure you head on over to our full review to find out how that battery life comparison actually matches up. But for now, one important thing I want to point out is that the C1 modem doesn't support millimeter wave 5G. That's not a crucial difference here in the US unless you're a Verizon user who's super used to those really fast speeds already. But on the AT&T SIM that I was provided with on the review unit, I saw pretty good speeds and very little, if any, interference with signals at all. I'm going to rattle through a quick list of other little differences between the iPhone 16e and iPhone 16 now, just in case any of them matter to you. The iPhone 16 supports Wi-Fi 7, it supports Thread, which is the smart home sort of standard, as well as MagSafe. So that last one is kind of controversial. Not a lot of people in my real world circle of friends uses it, but for me, I like to put my phone on a magnetic charging stand and have its screen sort of face out while I work and as it charges. So that is important to people who have existing MagSafe accessories, but if you don't, then you might not find yourself quite so bothered by it. If you do use wireless charging though, which is different from MagSafe, which is the magnetic system that holds things in place, The wireless charging speeds on the iPhone 16e are 7.5 watts, so that's lower than the 15 watt that is supported on the iPhone 16 and up. One more difference you may or may not notice is that the peak brightness on the 16e is not quite as high as on the iPhone 16. This really didn't bother me. I was still able to see the iPhone 16e screen very clearly in bright sunlight, so really it only matters if you've struggled before with dim phones. Finally, to the tiny ant-sized differences. Looking at the physical dimensions of the phones, the iPhone 16e is actually ever so slightly shorter than the iPhone 16. It's 5.78 inches tall compared to the 5.81 inches on the iPhone 16. It's also a tiny bit lighter, with the iPhone 16e weighing 5.88 ounces and the 16 coming in at 6 ounces. Now, on to some of the other broad similarities across the 16e and the iPhone 16. I already said they have the same screen size. Both also have the relatively new Action button. And on the iPhone 16e, you can actually configure it to launch, say, the camera app or the flashlight or any number of macros you want to set up through the Shortcuts app. But it also allows you to access visual intelligence. Now, visual intelligence is a feature that up until now is only accessible through camera control, and it's basically Apple's answer to Google Lens, where you basically point your iPhone's camera at anything and it'll tell you answers about things you see in your world. So you can either use Google to do an image search for it or ask ChatGPT something about it. I basically mapped the Action button on the 16e to launch the camera and never looked back, because I really like camera control for quickly pulling out the camera on any iPhone that has it. And so not having it on an iPhone 16e was actually a bummer. And so I'm glad I was able to configure the Action button to do that. Now, visual intelligence is only one part of the Apple Intelligence experience. You'll get pretty much everything else on the iPhone 16e. For example, fun things like Image Playground, Genmoji, or not so fun or probably controversial things like notification summaries. You can also use writing tools. There's a wide variety of Apple Intelligence features in iOS 18 that you can stay tuned for our review of those features to learn more about. The last similarity between the 16e and the iPhone 16 that I'll mention for this video anyway is that the storage models are about the same. They both start at 128 gigs, go up to 256 or 512, and the pricing is obviously different. You'll start with $599 for the 128 gig model for the iPhone 16e, and start at $799 for the equivalent iPhone 16. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but I do want to reiterate that if you're looking for a new iPhone, you don't have to go with an iPhone 16. If you're willing to skip Apple Intelligence, you'll still find a very solid phone in the iPhone 15, which has 2 cameras and starts at just $699 compared to the $799 of the iPhone 16. The iPhone 15 comes with an A16 Bionic chip and Dynamic Island. So if those are things you were looking out for, the 15 is a very serious contender for the phone you should get. But for a more in-depth evaluation of the iPhone 16e versus what other phones are available out there, make sure you go over to Engadget.com for the full review, where I'll have impressions on things like handling and daily performance, as well as battery life. So make sure you go over to Engadget.com.